It all started with a hug, but not just any hug. It was in the rain, in a forgotten alley, between two strangers who didn't even exchange their names. She found him crying, broken, alone, not saying a word. And without asking anything, she simply hugged him. What she didn't know is that this man had been left at the altar, and he carried a secret that would change everything. Sometimes it's the most unlikely encounters that reveal truths we've never dared to face. And the simplest gesture can be the beginning of something no one could have predicted. But what happened next, no one was prepared for. Stay until the end, because this is not just a story about love, it's about healing, choices, and the silent power of staying when everyone else walks away. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Your like helps this channel grow and keep bringing stories like this. Share it with someone special. Chicago breathed in gray that night. A soft drizzle blurred the city's sharp edges, washing over rusted fire escapes, glowing neon signs, and the ancient bricks that lined the narrow alley behind Whitman's books. The scent of rain on concrete, mixed with old paper and cinnamon from the cafe next door, hanging like a memory in the air. It was the kind of night that made the past feel close, the kind of night that whispered to your bones. Isabella Carter, 29, stepped outside through the back door, the hinges groaning behind her. She pulled her cardigan tighter against the wind, her fingers raw from hours handling books, dust, and time. A heavy black trash bag scraped the ground behind her, its weight insignificant compared to what she carried inside. Her life had learned to move in silence. She preferred it that way. Noise had failed her once. The alley was darker than usual, a single flickering bulb casting a puddle of pale light, the rest swallowed by shadows. She had taken this path home hundreds of times and never once hesitated. Until tonight, a sound stopped her in her tracks. Not the usual urban lullaby of car horns, sirens, or distant music, but something intimate and broken. A sob, low and desperate, catching like a splinter in the air. She squinted into the shadows near the dumpster, heart thudding, unsure if she'd imagined it. But then she saw him. A man sitting on the cold, wet ground, his back against the brick wall, knees drawn to his chest. He was soaked through, his navy suit clinging to his frame, tie loose, shoes muddy. His face was hidden behind trembling hands, and yet everything about him screamed pain. Not the everyday kind, the kind that cracks something inside, the kind that steals your breath and leaves you questioning the point of getting up. She didn't call out, didn't ask if he was okay. She just moved. Isabella let the trash bag fall to the ground and walked toward him without a word. Each step felt heavy, not with fear, but with recognition. She knew that kind of grief, knew what it was to be invisible while drowning. Without asking permission, without hesitation, she crouched beside him. Rain soaked her knees. Cold seeped through her sweater. Her hand hovered for a breath, then gently wrapped around his shoulders. At first he flinched. She felt the resistance ripple through him like electricity. A man unused to kindness, or maybe one who no longer believed he deserved it. But she didn't let go. Her embrace wasn't tight, it wasn't desperate. It was simply present, like a lighthouse refusing to blink, waiting through the storm. The rain continued its steady rhythm around them, the scent of wet wool, faded cologne, and something faintly metallic filled her senses. She felt the moment he stopped shaking. His breath hitched, then slowed. His hands dropped slightly, brushing against her arm, and for a second his forehead rested near her collarbone. He didn't speak. She didn't need him to. Sometimes words are intrusions. Sometimes silence is the most sacred form of love. She had no idea who he was. And strangely, it didn't matter. All she knew was that pain this raw had no strangers. Her fingers remained on his shoulder, firm but gentle. She remembered the day her parents were lost in a car crash, the silence that followed, the fiancé, who left 6 months later, unable to carry the weight of her sorrow. She remembered sitting on the floor in her own apartment, knees tucked just like his, unable to speak, barely breathing. And someone, a neighbor she never saw again, had offered her tea and a blanket. No words, just presence. That memory had never left. Maybe that's why she stopped. Minutes passed. Or maybe lifetimes. She couldn't tell. The alley had become a cocoon, a pocket of time where only grief and grace existed. Then, as if surfacing. From deep water, the man finally spoke, his voice raw and low. "Why did you stop?" She blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. Then he clarified, lifting his head slightly. "Why did you stop for me?" She looked into his eyes. They were the kind of blue that seemed too sharp for a night like this, rimmed, with red shadows carved deep around them. There was elegance in his features, even in distress. A man used to power. But now he looked unmade. "Because someone once stopped for me," she said softly, "when I couldn't speak." He looked down again. His fingers fiddled with something around his neck, a leather cord. Hanging from it was a ring. Not on his hand. Not anymore. She didn't comment, but she saw his eyes flick to hers once more. Did it help? No, she admitted. Not at first, but it planted something. A warmth I didn't know I could feel again. A silence followed, not uncomfortable. More like an exhale neither of them knew they were holding. Then slowly, with effort, he pulled himself upright. Isabella stood as well, brushing her soaked hair from her face. She offered her hand, not as a stranger introducing herself, but as a human saying, "I see you." He didn't take it, but he didn't walk away either. She turned and began to head back. To the bookstore, her steps slow. She didn't look back. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't give hers, and yet something had shifted. As she opened the back door, warmth from inside meeting the chill on her skin, she felt a strange lightness in her chest. Like part of her grief had been borrowed for a while and left behind with him. Maybe that was what kindness really was. A brief moment where someone else holds your pain just long enough for you to breathe, and maybe, just maybe. That hug in the rain was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The next morning, the city was bathed in gold, as if the rain had rinsed the world clean, and now the sun was trying to fill in the cracks. Chicago pulsed with its usual rhythm. Too many cars, too little silence, too many people pretending. They weren't breaking in small, invisible ways. Inside the bookstore, Isabella moved like a shadow through the aisles. She had opened the store an hour early, as usual, not because it was required, but because she needed the quiet before the world woke up. There was a kind of peace in rearranging books by color, by mood, by the whisper of intuition only a true book lover would understand. She liked the scent of old paper in the morning. It reminded her of her mother's home office, back when life still made sense. But something was different today. She felt it in the way her hands trembled when she picked up a stack of poetry books, in the way her chest ached when she passed, by the back door. The image of him, the man from the alley, kept replaying in her mind, not his face, not really, but the weight of his body in her arms, the quiet devastation in his voice, the ring on the leather cord. She hadn't meant to carry him with her, and yet here he was. Still, Isabella paused by the display window and stared out into the bustling street. Couples holding hands, a boy chasing a pigeon, a man in a suit talking loudly into his phone. The world kept moving, unaware of the lives unraveling in its shadows. And her, she was one of them, unraveled long ago. Most people looked at Isabella and saw kindness, the patient woman who remembered your name, your favorite author, your go-to rainy day read. But beneath the warmth lived a story she rarely spoke of, not because it was a secret, but because some stories stop breathing the moment you put them into words. 5 years ago, she lost everything. Her parents, Claire and Joseph Carter, were driving back from a weekend retreat in Vermont. Her mother had just accepted early retirement to open a book cafe with her. Her father had finally said yes to taking painting classes again. The car was hit by a truck whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. There were no survivors, and the call came on a Sunday morning. It shattered her. She remembered falling to the floor in her kitchen, still clutching the phone, her coffee mug breaking beside her. She remembered screaming, not with sound, but with the kind of silence that curls. up in your throat and eats the air. For days she couldn't speak, couldn't eat, couldn't exist. Her fiancé at the time, Daniel, tried. For the first few weeks he tried. Flowers, dinners, therapist appointments. But grief wasn't something you could fix. It wasn't linear. It was a house with no doors, no windows, just an echo that looped endlessly. And Daniel? He grew tired of the silence. One afternoon, while she was lying on the living room rug staring at the ceiling, he placed the engagement ring on the coffee table and left. No explanation, no goodbye. Just the sound of the door closing. Another absence added to her collection. That was the day Isabella stopped expecting anything from anyone. She didn't close off exactly. She just simplified. She poured herself into books, routines, small kindnesses. She gave everything without asking for anything back. That way no one could disappoint her. That way she didn't have to risk needing anyone again. Until last night. Until that man, whose name she didn't know, cracked something open with nothing but a moment of shared silence in the rain. She should have walked past him. She should have thought of safety, of boundaries. But there was something in his posture, his grief, that mirrored her own. Not perfectly, but enough to recognize. Grief is its own language, and when two people speak it, even strangers feel familiar. As she returned to shelving the books, her fingers brushed against the spine of a novel that stopped her cold. The Alchemist, her mother's favorite. Tears prickled at the corner of her eyes. She swallowed hard, forcing the wave back down. Not now, not here. She closed the book and slid it onto the shelf, her hands lingering for a moment longer than needed. In another part of the city, at that same moment, Ethan Walker sat alone in a hotel suite that felt more like a museum than a home. His tuxedo hung discarded over a chair. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages he wasn't ready to read. He'd silenced the notifications hours ago, but the glow kept returning. Journalists, lawyers, family, friends, or worse, those pretending to be. But he only heard one thing in his mind: the silence of the chapel when Lauren never showed, the whispers, the gasps, the eyes on him as the realization sunk in, the void left behind where vows were supposed to be exchanged. He remembered how the priest lowered his head, how his mother squeezed his arm but said nothing, how his brother handed him a glass of scotch without a word. He left before the reception ever began. No one stopped him. They probably didn't know how. He walked, and kept walking until the city blurred, until he found himself in that alley, in that rain, crying for the first time in decades. He hadn't even realized he'd collapsed until she touched him. That woman, that stranger, she hadn't asked for his name. She hadn't judged him. She hadn't treated him like the billionaire tech mogul who just got publicly humiliated. She treated him like a human. And that had undone him more than the betrayal. He reached for the ring still hanging from the leather cord and pressed it against his chest. Not because he missed Lauren, but because it reminded him of what he thought he knew, and how quickly it all vanished. What do you do when the person you planned a life with simply erases you? You let go, or you lose yourself. He stared at the wall, then down at the coffee table, where his assistant had left that morning's newspaper, and there it was, his name on the front page. Tech billionaire Ethan Walker left at the altar. Sources say bride cited irreconcilable truths. He laughed once, dry, bitter, but it was the photo that made his breath catch. There, in the corner of the frame, barely noticeable, was her, the woman from the alley. Only part of her face was visible, blurred in the background, but he knew. He recognized the cardigan, the soaked hair, the kindness in her eyes. She hadn't told him her name, but now he had a name to find her by. That Sunday evening, as the city began to exhale from the weekend rush, Isabella sat by the small window in her apartment, curled up with a half-drunk cup of chamomile tea. The mug, chipped on the side, bore the phrase, "Words heal where medicine fails." Her mother had given it to her on her 25th birthday. It still held the warmth of that moment, even though her hands had turned cold. Outside, clouds began to reclaim the sky. The sunset smeared streaks of orange and violet across the skyline, but she didn't notice. Her thoughts weren't in the present. They were wrapped around a man she had never expected to meet. in a moment she had never planned to offer, in a silence that spoke louder than anything she had heard in years. She hadn't told anyone, not her friend Rachel, not her boss Mr. Henderson, not even the journal where she usually emptied her heart in ink. That moment in the alley felt too sacred, too delicate to be retold, like a fragile glass that might shatter if touched by explanation. And the strangest part, she didn't regret it. For the first time in years, she had done something without overthinking. No plans, no safety net, just instinct, pure human instinct, to comfort a soul that looked far too much like her own once had. That hug had changed her, not in an obvious way. She hadn't woken up feeling transformed or suddenly free from the weight she'd carried for years. But something had shifted. The memory of his body shaking under her arms still lived in her muscles. His question, "Why did you stop?" echoed between heartbeats. She had no answer that made logical sense. But her soul had known. Some people walk past pain without looking. Others recognize it, even in strangers, because they've sat in that same darkness. She didn't need to know his name to know his suffering was real. What she didn't know was that he hadn't forgotten either. In a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Ethan Walker stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon as if it could offer clarity. The lake shimmered beneath the city lights, a false calm masking its depth. He hadn't left the apartment all day. He couldn't. He'd spent the morning revisiting everything, the wedding, the silence, the letter Lauren had left behind it. The altar, sealed with gold wax but containing only 5 words, "I'm not what you need." That was it, no signature, no apology. Just an absence pretending to be closure. But Ethan didn't care about Lauren anymore, not really. What haunted him was the alley, the rain, the woman who didn't flinch when he broke in front of her. Who was she? Not a reporter, not a stranger. Trying to profit from his name, that much he was sure of. She hadn't recognized him, or if she had, it hadn't mattered. Her eyes didn't carry curiosity. They carried knowing, familiarity, compassion, and that hug. God, that hug. It had felt like something he didn't know he needed until it was there. Like a dam broke inside of him, and her arms were the only thing keeping him from washing away. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic, it was human. He hadn't spoken about it to anyone, not even his brother, not his assistant. But that night, as he sat down on the couch with his laptop, something in him stirred, a compulsion. He opened a blank document and began typing. Not code, not a business pitch, but a memory. The hug, the rain, the cardigan, the silence. He wrote everything, every detail he could remember. The way her eyes stayed calm when his collapsed, the way she didn't ask, didn't preach, didn't run. It was the first honest thing he'd written in years. Meanwhile, Isabella had returned to her routine, shelving books, helping customers, running her community reading hour, but something had altered in her rhythm. She found herself glancing toward the back door more often, not expecting him, just wondering. Had it helped him? Had her presence mattered, or had he already forgotten? She hated that she cared, hated how his pain had left a fingerprint on hers. She reminded herself that it was just a moment, just an act of kindness. Not a thread meant to stretch into something more, but something inside her whispered otherwise. Days passed, rain gave way to sun, and Chicago shifted into one of those rare spring weeks when everything feels briefly possible again. Isabella returned, home late one night, and found herself stopping in front of the alley. The same one. She didn't enter. She just stood at the edge, staring, remembering. There were no footprints left, no trace of what had happened, but her body remembered. Her heart, too. That's when she realized something. That moment had given something to both of them. Not healing, not instantly, but a doorway, a door she didn't know if either of them would walk through, but one that existed now. And doors have a way of waiting. The bell above the bookstore door chimed, just as Isabella was restocking a shelf of biographies near the front window. She didn't glance up immediately. Mondays were quiet, and the morning crowd typically brought regulars looking for routine, rather than surprise. But something about the shift in the air caught her attention. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or the scent of espresso from the cafe next door that clung to Coates. It was a silence, a pause in movement, like someone standing still and observing before approaching. Her heart ticked a little faster, though she couldn't have said why. She turned slowly, ready to offer a polite greeting. But the man had already stepped away from the door and disappeared down the fiction aisle. Strange, she thought. He didn't seem familiar, but the outline of his coat, the measured way he moved, it stirred something, a flicker of recognition too faint to name. Shaking it off, Isabella returned to her task, fingers brushing dust jackets and the scent of old paper rising around her like memory. She reminded herself to stay grounded. She had books to catalogue, orders to place, real things that kept her safe from whatever feeling had just tugged at her chest. But fate doesn't care for our lists. At noon, she sat behind the counter, sipping lukewarm tea from her chipped mug, when Mr. Henderson emerged from the back office, holding the morning's copy of the Chicago Tribune. He was frowning, his thick eyebrows furrowed in disbelief. "You're not going to believe this," he said, placing the paper between them on the counter. Isabella glanced down casually, then froze. Front page, black and white photo, flashbulbs. Paparazzi. A man in a tuxedo standing alone on the steps of a cathedral. Expression unreadable, eyes downcast, tie loosened. The headline screamed in bold serif font. Tech billionaire Ethan Walker left at the altar. Sources say bride fled hours before ceremony. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. Ethan. His name was Ethan, the man from the alley, the one who had crumbled into her arms, the stranger whose sorrow had soaked into her bones like the rain on her cardigan. It was him. Mr. Henderson kept talking, something about scandal, stock drops, speculation. But his voice became background noise, drowned out by the rush in her ears. She lifted the paper slowly, scanning the article. Ethan Walker, 34, CEO of Walker Tech, one of the country's youngest billionaires, was reportedly abandoned just hours. Before exchanging vows with fiancée Lauren Prescott, photos followed. One of the church empty pews visible through open doors, one of Lauren boarding a private car, face half covered, and one of Ethan, drenched and alone. But there, tucked in the corner, almost cropped out of frame, was another photo. A grainy shot the alley the moment, and her. Isabella gasped softly, the sound escaping before she could contain it. There she was, her profile barely visible, blurred and soaked, but unmistakably her, the cardigan, the curve of her arm around his shoulders. It had been taken from a distance, and yet the intimacy of the moment still pulsed through the image. No caption mentioned her, no article identified her, but she knew, and suddenly it all felt too real. She folded the paper gently and excused herself to the back room, her tea forgotten. Behind the door she sat on the worn leather couch and tried to steady her hands. He was famous. He was that Ethan Walker, and now the entire world knew his. Heartbreak, speculated on it, fed off it. But she had felt it, before the headlines, before the flashbulbs, before he had a name. She closed her eyes, replaying the night in her mind with new clarity. How he hadn't spoken much, how he hadn't looked up for a long time, how he clung to silence like it was the last honest thing he had left. She had met the man, not the myth, and now she felt the weight of knowing. Back in the store, customers wandered in and out, some whispering about the headline, others giggling over the scandal. A woman even joked to her husband that she would have run too, if she'd had a chance to marry a billionaire and then vanish with the dress. Isabella didn't laugh. She couldn't. That hug, that connection. It wasn't a story for public consumption. It wasn't tabloid fodder. It had been something sacred, raw, human. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, that the world now saw him as a broken fairy tale, or that she was the only one who had seen the man before the fall. And yet, she didn't speak, not to Mr. Henderson, not to the customers, not to Rachel when she called later that evening and mentioned the story in passing. She kept the truth tucked away, a secret between her soul and the silence they had shared. That night she sat by her window again, the newspaper folded neatly beside her. The city lights blinked like stars trying to be seen through the noise. She traced her fingers over the blurred image of her and Ethan, not for fame, not for proof, but to remember that something had happened, that in a world obsessed with headlines, someone had chosen to see and to be seen, without a single word spoken. And though she told herself it was foolish, a thought whispered beneath the noise. Would he come back? The rain had returned, not in torrents but in a soft drizzle, the kind that lingered like a memory rather than a storm. It tapped gently against the bookstore windows, a rhythm so familiar it felt like part of the walls. Isabella stood near the recommended reads table, reorganizing the titles just for something to do with her hands. Her fingers moved books from one stack to another, barely noticing their covers. Outside, the world was wrapped in grey again, and something inside her felt expectant. 3 days had passed since the newspaper headline. 3 days since she discovered his name. Since her heart had begun carrying a strange, quiet question it couldn't put down. Would he come? She had replayed that thought so many times she hated herself for it. She had no right to expect anything. It had been one moment, one night, one hug, but her soul refused to call it small. It had felt like the world shifted under her feet, and when the world shifts you remember who was standing next to you when it moved. The front door chimed. She didn't look up at first. She couldn't afford to keep getting disappointed every time it wasn't him. But then the silence hit her again. Not absence, but pause. The air changed in the way it does when someone walks into the room who isn't there just to browse. The energy wasn't loud. It was focused, intentional. She turned, and there he was, Ethan, hair still damp from the rain. No entourage, no sunglasses to shield him from the public, no mask of wealth or polished power. Just a man in a grey wool coat, standing a few feet inside the doorway, scanning the room like he didn't know what he was searching for, until his eyes found hers. They locked. Not with surprise, not even with awkwardness, but with something else, recognition. He took one slow step forward, then another, careful not to shatter the fragile quiet between them. "Hi," he said simply. His voice was softer than she remembered, more grounded, like he had left something behind the night they met and had only just realized it. Isabella's throat tightened. "Hi?" A beat of silence passed. "I was looking for a book," he said, his eyes holding hers. "The Alchemist. Someone once told me it changes people." Isabella blinked. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. She walked to the fiction, aisle not asking him to follow, but he did, step by step. No distance now between them, but the air thick with everything unsaid. She stopped at the familiar shelf, fingers brushing the spine before pulling the book free. The cover was a little worn from time, just like hers at home. She handed it to him without a word. He took it with both hands. "Do you believe it can change people?" he asked. She looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't the man from the newspaper, not the billionaire, not the abandoned groom, not the symbol of scandal and sympathy. He was the man who had collapsed in an alley, the man who had held her silence like it meant something. "I believe," she said slowly, "that the right book finds you when you need it." He nodded. Another pause. "Thank you," he said, though it was clear he wasn't just thanking her. "For the book." His eyes said everything else. She nodded in return. But before she could turn away, he spoke again. "Have we met before?" The question was gentle, almost playful. A crack in the formal armor he wore. Isabella hesitated. There it was, the moment she could confess. Say yes. Say I was there. Say you cried in my arms and I said nothing because I knew that was what you needed. But instead she tilted her head slightly and gave a half smile. "I think you were looking for something," she replied, and ended. "Up here instead." He studied her face for a long second. Maybe he remembered. Maybe he didn't. Maybe the memory was buried deep in a fog of heartbreak and rain. But he smiled. "A real one, small but real." "Maybe I was." He bought the book, no signature, no fuss. He paid in cash and didn't ask for a bag. As he turned to leave, he paused by the door and glanced back. "I'll let you know if it changes me." Then he stepped into the rain, coat collar turned up, book tucked beneath his arm like something precious. And Isabella. She stood still for a long time, heart pounding, not because she had seen him again, but because a door had opened. Quietly, gently. Like the beginning of a story that neither of them had planned to write, and this time, neither of them was walking past it. The following week unfolded in slow motion, not because anything particularly dramatic happened, but because something had begun to shift, something soft, barely visible, like the way leaves begin to turn before anyone notices the season changing. Ethan started visiting the bookstore, not every day, but often enough to be noticed. He never came with an entourage, never wore anything that screamed billionaire. In fact, his clothing was deceptively simple. Dark coats, clean sweaters, polished shoes that had clearly once been expensive, but now carried the scuff marks of a man too distracted to care. Each time he entered, he offered a quiet nod in Isabella's direction. No pretense, no charm offensive, just presence. And each time she felt something stir in her. He didn't speak much. Often he browsed for 15 or 20 minutes, picked out a book, sometimes something deep and reflective, sometimes a slim novel with no title she recognized, and sat by the reading nook in the far corner. From the front desk, Isabella could see him through the shelves. He always read with a kind of stillness that didn't belong to the digital world he came from. And sometimes he didn't read at all. Sometimes he just sat, staring at the pages, but not turning them, as if the act of being there, within those four quiet walls lined with stories, was enough. Isabella, at first, said nothing. She didn't want to chase the moment, didn't want to force a connection that was growing slowly and organically. But over time she began doing something else instead, leaving books at the reading nook, books about healing, grief, forgiveness, purpose, not recommendations exactly, just offerings. She'd place one beside the armchair before the store opened, walk away and pretend it had always been there. Sometimes he picked them up, sometimes he didn't. But the first time he left a book behind in return, a copy of Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke, bookmarked with a blank card. She found herself smiling like a teenager. They never spoke about the exchange, but the silence between them began to grow roots. One Thursday, just before closing, she was locking the front display case when she heard the now familiar chime. She didn't look up right away, but then she heard his voice, quiet, cautious, curious. "Do you drink coffee?" She turned, caught off guard not by the question itself, but by how hopeful it sounded. "Sometimes," she replied. He nodded. "Would you join me tomorrow morning? There's a little place across from the park. They serve it strong and quietly." She studied him for a second, his face still holding the weight of recent wounds, but with eyes that now carried something else. Invitation. "Okay," she said softly. "Tomorrow." That morning, the air outside tasted like autumn. They sat at a window seat, the two of them framed by golden trees and children playing on the far side of the park. The cafe was quiet, filled with soft jazz and the scent of cinnamon scones. Ethan ordered black coffee. Isabella asked for oat milk and a little honey. She noticed he remembered it when the second cup arrived, without her needing to ask. But what struck her wasn't the coffee, or even the kindness. It was the silence. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. The kind of silence that settles between two people who don't feel the need to fill it with noise, who can sit across from each other and just be. She asked no questions about Lauren. He offered nothing about the wedding. They spoke about books, about how people are drawn to certain titles without understanding why, about how some stories heal, not because they give answers, but because they give permission to feel. He told her he hadn't read in years before the alley. She told him some wounds don't respond to time, only tenderness. He looked at her then, really looked. Like he was trying to memorize her, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, something internal. "I didn't expect to find this," he said quietly. She didn't ask what this meant. She didn't need to. They stayed an hour, maybe more. And when they stepped back into the crisp morning, Something between them had changed, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. That night, as Isabella closed the store, she found a note tucked inside one of the returned books. No name, no signature, just 10 words. Your silence did more than words ever could. It was a Saturday morning when the invitation came. The city had shaken off the last of its early autumn chill, and Chicago was finally settling into a rhythm of cool breezes, amber leaves, and that fleeting warmth that only comes before winter. Sets in for real. Isabella had spent the morning restocking shelves, humming softly to herself, when Ethan walked in, not with a book in hand, but with something else, an uncertainty in his expression. Like he was about to step into territory he didn't quite understand. "Hey," he said gently. She looked up, noting the way his jacket clung to his shoulders as though he'd been walking through wind. His hair was slightly tousled, and for once his phone wasn't in sight. He seemed disarmed, in a way that made her heart soften even before he spoke. "I was wondering if you had plans this afternoon." Isabella raised an eyebrow, not teasing, just curious. "There's an event," he continued. "A book drive for kids. You mentioned it once, I think. The one your friend Rachel organizes?" She blinked. She had mentioned it, in passing, weeks ago. She hadn't expected him to remember, let alone show interest. "I'm reading stories to the kids," she said. "There'll be music, snacks, chaos." He smiled, but there was a flicker of nervousness beneath it. "Would it be okay if I came? Maybe helped?" Isabella hesitated, not because she didn't want him there, but because she knew what it meant for him. Ethan Walker, CEO of Walker Tech, the man who was once a fixture in boardrooms and on magazine covers, now asking if he could read children's books to a room full of 5-year-olds with sticky hands and chocolate-covered faces. But there was sincerity in his voice, vulnerability, a quiet longing she recognized too well. "Yes," she said. "Of course." That afternoon, they walked side by side down a quiet neighborhood street in Westtown, where a small community center buzzed with laughter, music, and the scent of popcorn. Bright banners hung above the entrance. Paper butterflies made by local kids dangled from the doorframe. Inside, the chaos was beautiful. Children ran barefoot across foam mats. Volunteers sorted donated books into color-coded bins. Parents chatted over coffee, and in the corner a painted mural of a tree stretched across the wall, each leaf bearing a handwritten dream. Ethan stood quietly for a moment, taking it all in. She saw him adjust his posture slightly, as though unsure whether to act like a guest, a sponsor, or just a man. Then one of the kids, no more than 6, tugged at his coat. "Are you going to read the book with the dragon?" Ethan blinked. I can try." The boy grinned and bolted away. Isabella handed Ethan a picture book, its cover colorful and dog-eared. "You don't have to do voices," she said with a laugh. "But if you do, you'll be a hero." He smirked nervously. "No promises." They sat on a thick carpet circle as children gathered around like gravity had drawn them there. Isabella watched from a few feet away, resisting the urge to coach or guide. She wanted this moment to belong to him. And then he began to read. Stiff at first, his voice quiet, uncertain, but by page 3 something shifted. One of the girls laughed out loud at a character's name. A boy clapped when the dragon flew into space. Ethan started using different voices, one for each character, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. His brow furrowed with every plot twist. He gasped at surprises. He whispered during suspense. And when he read the final line, the kids burst into applause. Isabella could barely believe it. The transformation, the way his shoulders had dropped, the way his eyes glowed, not from performance but from connection. He wasn't the billionaire in that moment. He wasn't the man left at the altar. He was someone new. Afterward, as they helped organize the books into stacks, he turned to her and said something she hadn't expected. "I haven't laughed like that in years." She smiled. "You were good with them." He looked down at his hands. "I forgot what it was like to be useful without being important." The words sank deep. She wanted to tell him he had always mattered, that he didn't need a title or a press release to be worthy. But something told her he didn't need to hear it, he needed to feel it. And today, he had. As they prepared to leave, one of the kids, Leo, a curly-haired boy with a crooked smile, ran up and shoved a folded paper into Ethan's hands. It was a drawing, a stick-figure version of Ethan with a giant dragon behind him. "You were the dragon guy," Leo said proudly. "You can come back next time." Ethan crouched to meet his eye level. "I'd like that." And Isabella, watching from a few feet away, felt something settle in her chest. Not a conclusion, but a beginning. The next morning, the bell above the bookstore door rang earlier than usual. Isabella was still unlocking the front shelves when she heard it. The rain from the night before had left a trail of soft mist on the windows, and the golden morning light painted warm shadows across the floor. She turned, expecting a delivery, maybe Rachel stopping by with breakfast, but it was Ethan. He stood just inside the door, his coat still damp, holding something in both hands. Not a book, not a coffee, not the quiet confidence he usually carried. It was a wooden box, not large but carefully wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, with a small dried flower, lavender maybe, tucked into the knot. He looked like he'd been standing outside rehearsing for 10 minutes before gathering the courage to come in. "Hi," he said. She smiled. "Hi." There was a pause. Then he held the box toward her. "I saw this a few weeks ago," he said, voice soft, "and I thought, I don't know, maybe you'd like it, or maybe it would like you." She took it gently, the weight of it unfamiliar but comforting. Her fingertips brushed his as she did. "What is it?" He shrugged, but not casually. More like he didn't want to ruin the moment with too many words. "Open it." She untied the twine slowly, careful not to tear the flower, then peeled the paper back and lifted the lid. Inside was an antique book press, small, cast iron, beautifully, worn by time, the kind used to flatten and bind pages after being repaired. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd seen one just like it years ago, in a collector's shop while traveling with her mother. They had marveled at it through the glass, and her mother had said, "Someday, when your bookstore has its own restoration corner, we'll come back for it." That day had never come. But now, here it was. Isabella looked up, eyes shining with something too layered to name. "How did you—" "You mentioned once," he said, "that you used to restore old books by hand, and that your mother taught." You said you missed it." She blinked, stunned. "I didn't think you were really listening." "I was," he said. "I always am with you." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, not loud, just full. Full of things unsaid, of gratitude, of recognition, of something that had quietly passed from curiosity into care. "I know. It's not conventional," he added, a little unsure now. "Most people don't give book presses as gifts." "No," she said, voice catching. "Most people don't. That's why this matters." She ran her fingers over the smooth iron, feeling its history, its purpose, its weight, and she thought, this is what love might look like when it's not trying to impress, when it simply sees. "It reminded me of you," he said. "Not just because you fix books, but because you don't try to erase the damage, you just help them hold together again." That's when the tears came. Not heavy, not dramatic, just a single drop sliding quietly down her cheek. He didn't reach to wipe it. He just stood there. Let her have her emotion, let her feel without interruption. She closed the box and hugged it gently to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." He smiled, but there was a vulnerability behind it, like he'd just handed her a piece of himself and was waiting to see what she'd do with it. "I wasn't sure if it was too much," he admitted. Isabella shook her head. "It's not." Then, after a breath, "You're not." For a man who had once been surrounded by people who only saw his name, his money, his mistakes, those words landed deeper than she could have imagined. That evening, after he left, she stayed in the shop long past closing. She cleared a small space in the back room, placed the press on a sturdy table near the window, and dusted off her old cloths and repair tools. It felt like a return. Like a bridge between past and present had been quietly built when she wasn't looking. She pressed her first book just after midnight, a poetry collection by Rilke. It creaked softly beneath the weight, and in that sound she heard everything. Hope, memory, and the quiet truth that sometimes the smallest gifts carry the loudest meaning. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that began with promise, sunlight slanting warmly through the bookstore windows, soft jazz playing in the background, and Isabella arriving early with a croissant in one hand and a list of new arrivals in the other. The kind of day when everything felt settled, and then she walked in. At first, Isabella didn't register her presence. The bell above the door chimed like it always did. Another customer, another passerby looking for a gift or a quiet escape. But then silence fell. Not the comforting kind she was used to, but a strange, tense stillness that made her look up. The woman standing by the entrance was tall, striking, expensively dressed but not in a showy way. Her coat was tailored, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. But her eyes, those betrayed everything. Isabella felt it before she knew it. This wasn't just any customer. This was her, Lauren, the woman who left Ethan at the altar. She didn't need to be told. The recognition struck like instinct. The symmetry of their stories now standing on opposite sides of the same counter. Lauren approached slowly, eyes scanning the store like it was unfamiliar ground. She stopped at the front table, ran her fingers absently across a book spine, then looked up. "Is Ethan here?" Isabella blinked, her body still. "No," she replied, voice calm. "Too calm." Lauren gave a small nod as if she'd expected that answer. "I thought maybe he would be," she said. "He mentioned this place once, said it was peaceful." There was a pause. Isabella didn't invite her to sit, didn't offer tea. She waited. Lauren exhaled. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "I panicked. Everything got too big, too visible. And Ethan, he never stopped moving. I didn't know how to keep up." Isabella studied her. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't dramatic. She was simply there, like someone trying to re-enter a house where the locks had already changed. "I want to talk to him," Lauren continued. "Face to face. Not about the wedding. Not about what happened. Just about what's still between us." Isabella's fingers curled slightly over the counter. She didn't say the truth she felt in her chest, that Ethan had already begun unbuilding whatever once existed between them. That something softer, something slower, had taken root in its place. Something real, but Lauren wasn't there for her approval. She was there for a door, and Ethan, whether ready or not, was still the one holding the key. "I can let him know." "You stopped by," Isabella said. Lauren offered a quiet, grateful smile. "Thank you." And then she left. No demands, no scene. Just quiet footsteps fading into the afternoon. Isabella stood still for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. But something inside her shifted. Because for the first time since that rainy night in the alley, doubt had crept in. A single question echoing louder than the silence Ethan and she had shared. Was she just a chapter in his recovery? Or the beginning of something new? She didn't wait for the answer. That evening, after closing, she packed a small suitcase, folded 3 blouses, a journal, 2 paperbacks. She took down a card from the bulletin board near the register, the one from Denver, inviting her months ago to volunteer with a literacy program for underserved children. She had ignored it back then. Too scared to leave, too afraid of change, but now she didn't want to stand still and wait for a decision that wasn't hers to make. She left a note with Mr. Henderson. "A quick trip. Back soon. Or maybe not. Tell them to keep reading." No? Note for Ethan, no goodbye, just a decision and a plane ticket. The absence hit harder than Ethan expected. It began subtly, like a page missing from a favorite book. No message, no note, just silence, but a different kind than they were used to. This wasn't the silence that connected. It was the kind that left space cold, empty. He first noticed it when he walked into Whitman's books 2 days after Lauren's unexpected visit. He had prepared a story, one that wasn't perfect, but honest. Something about how Lauren had shown up unannounced, how her apology felt too late, and how, standing there listening to her, he had realized that love, real love, wasn't something you return to. It was something you build. But Isabella wasn't there. Not behind the counter. Not organizing the shelves. Not seated in her usual spot beside the plant in the reading corner. The air felt different, the stillness inside the store unfamiliar. Mr. Henderson gave him a soft, knowing glance. "She's gone," the older man said gently. "Took a few things, didn't say much." Ethan blinked. "Gone where?" "Didn't say." He tried not to show it, but the word cracked something open inside him. Gone. Just like that. After everything. After them. Had he waited too long? Had she believed he still had something to resolve with Lauren? Was it his silence, once a bridge between them, that had finally become a wall? That night, Ethan sat in his apartment, staring out at the lights of Chicago. The skyline glimmered like a galaxy, but it felt distant, wrong. The life he had known, filled with press releases, quarterly goals, curated social appearances, now felt like a foreign language, because the only person who had taught him how to feel without performing had walked away, and he couldn't blame her. He stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and left the penthouse with a single goal: to find her. He started with the places she had once mentioned, softly, almost like confessions. A second-hand cafe tucked near Logan Square, where she used to write in the afternoons. A tiny used bookstore near the river, where her mother had taken her as a child. A mural she loved downtown, of a girl reading under a tree, her face tilted to the sky. He visited all of them, waited, asked, no sign, no trace. But he didn't stop. He went to the library where she once donated books, to the coffee shop where they'd shared that first quiet morning, even to the park, hoping irrationally that she might appear beside the bench where they once sat in silence, watching children run and leaves fall. Nothing. It was Rachel who finally answered his call. Her voice on the phone was both protective and gentle. "She left for Denver," she said. "She took the opportunity she had talked herself out of for months." He closed his eyes, heart tight. Did she say why? She said it was time. That maybe she was meant to make space again, for herself. A pause, and that maybe Ethan would understand. If he ever realized he didn't want someone to save him. He wanted someone to stay. The words landed hard, not as an accusation, but as a mirror, because she had stayed. In silence. In the bookstore. In every quiet act of presence. And when he hadn't given her clarity, she chose herself. That night, Ethan packed a bag for the first time in months. No assistant, no driver, no press release, just him, and a single destination, Denver. 2 weeks had passed since Isabella left. In Denver, the days were different, lighter, less urgent. The city carried its own kind of silence, not like Chicago's, which hid pains in alleys and honking horns, but an open silence, scented with mountains and whispered by the wind. Isabella felt at peace for the first time in a long time, not because she had forgotten Ethan, that would have been impossible, but because she had found parts of herself that had gotten lost along the way. The girl who used to read to the neighbors from the porch, the woman who restored books, with her mother on Sundays, the soul that believed kindness could change lives, even if quietly. At the community center, she spent her days organizing mobile libraries, reading to children, repairing books with torn covers and loose spines. She smiled more, slept better. But there still remained a space, not of pain but of absence. She didn't expect him to come, but he came. It was a cold afternoon. The wind whistled through the windows, and the branches outside swayed with force. The children had just finished the group reading session. Isabella was still sitting on the rug, packing the books into boxes, when she heard the door creak. She didn't need to look to know. Her heart knew before her eyes. Ethan was there. He entered slowly, as if he knew there was no rush anymore. He wore a dark wool coat, and his eyes carried everything he had never said: regret, longing, fear, and love. She stood up slowly. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. Neither of them spoke, until he finally did. "You didn't run away," he said. "You just chose yourself." Isabella held her breath, And it was the most beautiful and hardest thing anyone has ever done for me, even when it wasn't for me. She bit her lip. She had expected bitterness. She had expected justifications. But what came was only truth. I stayed still, he continued, waiting for silence to speak for me. But you taught me that presence without clarity is also a form of abandonment. She closed her eyes. A tear slid down silently, and then he stepped closer. Isabella, he said, his voice firm. I came because I choose you. Not because I'm broken, not because I need to be saved, but because your presence taught me to be whole. She looked at him then, as if seeing him for the first time, truly. I didn't come to find you, he said. I came to stay wherever you are. And for the first time since that rain in the alley, she smiled with her whole heart. But there was more. During those days apart, she had understood something important. True love isn't just about two hearts meeting. It's about what they decide to build together. What if, she said, we created something? He looked at her, curious. Something that turns what we've lived into purpose, that brings stories, books, and emotional care to places that have forgotten how to be welcomed. Children, families, entire communities. And that was how the Seed of the Kind Heart Foundation was born. An initiative not to erase the pains of the past, but to transform them into beacons for others. Mobile libraries, emotional listening workshops, reading spaces in hospitals and shelters, all with the human touch that neither technology nor money nor headlines could offer. Ethan used his influence to open doors. Isabella took care of every detail with the soul of a guardian of stories. They didn't return to the past. They created a new beginning. Together. 3 years had passed since that rainy night in the alley. Chicago looked different now, not because the skyline had changed, but because something in the hearts of those who walked its streets had transformed. At the entrance to a small alley, in West Loop, a new space had been born. What was once just a dark corridor between buildings now breathed light, color, and meaning. A hand-carved wooden sign greeted anyone who arrived, Kindness Alley, where silences embrace. The walls were covered with murals painted by local artists and public school children. There were hands holding, eyes that cried and smiled, embraces, in all shapes and colors. On one of the central walls, a poem read, "It wasn't the name nor the face, it was the gesture. It was the silence that remained, and that which healed without haste." In the center of the alley, a worn wooden bench served as a living memorial to what had begun there. The bench where Ethan and Isabella now sat side by side, in silence, whenever they returned to the place where it all began. Beside them, a brown-haired boy with curious eyes ran around, Logan, their son. He was 2.5 with an almost excessive love for illustrated books and a habit of sitting on the floor to hug any child who was crying. "Like Mommy did with Daddy," he would say, even though he didn't yet fully understand the weight of it. The Kind Heart Foundation was now operating in 5 states, with 12 mobile libraries, hundreds of volunteers, and an emotional reading program in partnership with public schools. But more than that, it had become a movement. It wasn't about donations. It was about gestures. Books donated came with handwritten notes. "This book helped me when I lost someone." Or, "Read this slowly. It taught me how to return to myself." In Kindness Alley, anyone could write their pain on a piece of paper, place it in a wooden box, and days later find a note in return, written by a stranger offering comfort. Sometimes it was a poem. Sometimes it just said, "I also." That afternoon, Ethan held an envelope in his hands. Inside was a copy of an article published that month in the New York Times, "The Woman Who Hugged a Stranger and Unknowingly Founded a Quiet Revolution." Isabella read in silence, then smiled. "It's an exaggeration," she said. "It's not," Ethan replied. "You changed the world with a hug." She looked at Logan playing and whispered, "Maybe he'll change even more." The sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow across the alley walls. Around them, people stopped, read the messages, took photos, cried. Some embraced without words. Others simply sat and breathed. And there, in that same alley, where a lonely pain had dissolved in the arms of a stranger, hope was born every day, because in the end it wasn't the last name, it wasn't the money, not even the scandal. It was the shared silence. It was the hug that asked for nothing in return. It was the kind of love that doesn't shout but transforms, and it continues to echo and whenever someone has the courage to stay. In the end, it wasn't the scandal. It wasn't the money. It wasn't fate. It was one gesture, a hug that crossed through the pain, a silence that embraced without judgment, and two souls that, upon recognizing each other, created something greater than the sum of their scars. Because real love doesn't come to complete. It comes to add. It comes to transform. And you? Have you ever hugged someone without asking for anything in return? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Your like helps this channel grow and keep bringing emotional stories like this. Share it with someone special.